All right, so this video is because in the last Blender club that we had, people were asking about the different types of coloring that you could do for 3D models. So I have prepared a bunch of different models, and they all have like different forms of coloring or texturing. So I'm going to go through all of them, and the different types are vertex painting, and I will sort of select these. Vertex painting, let me get rid of all this stuff. Axis, goodbye. All right, vertex painting, texture painting with maps, texture painting that is hand painted, and then just procedural coloring. So there are like these are sort of there's actually these two are both done with texture maps, but they're done in sort of different ways. This is done in more of a realistic way, involving normal maps, and this is involving just hand painting. There's no normal maps. It's just like a low res, stylized asset that is just all the shadows are painted. Whereas this one is hand painted, but also has a normal map. And then this one here is just a very simple ship that has weathering, which is done procedurally, which isn't done on a map or painted at all by hand. It's just procedural. Okay, so let's go through the different types and the benefits of each type. First of all, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all of them and go into edit mode so you can sort of see, and this might take some amount of time, so you can see the different sort of poly counts of each. So if I select this one here, you see, without doing anything, that this is extremely dense. This is a decimated model. It is extremely high poly because it was actually a higher poly model. It was a ZBrush model, which has been decimated. So these are this very weird geometry that is not animatable, but is used for more like props and stuff. And because it's really high poly, which is the key thing, it can be vertex painted. And I'm going to get to that in a second. So the vertex paint is very often used for some stage of a high poly model. So this is vertex painted, and you'll see it in a second. This one here, this turtle here, is a lot lower poly. It's kind of medium poly. If I were to select it like that, you'd see in this case it's about 6,000 faces. It's kind of lower poly, and it would be not really possible to do vertex painting in this because it's too low poly, but it was done with texture painting. And this one here is really low poly, or much lower poly, and again, it's pretty low poly. This is, very low poly, and it's all just done with hand painting. And the last one here is sort of like just different stuff, and it's just like a hard surface thing. It's kind of low poly also, and it was just done with very quickly with procedural texturing. Okay, so let's get into these things. So far, just to recap: vertex painting, texture painting, procedural. Okay, so let's start with this vertex painting. So this crab here is painted through vertex paint. It was actually painted in ZBrush, but it was done in the same way, which is called vertex painting. In ZBrush, it's called poly paint. This is used for high poly models, and it's done by just simply painting directly on the model. So again, I said that it's a high poly model. It is basically used for high poly models because vertex painting literally only paints the vertices. It paints each of those dots. If there were only a very few vertices and you had big spaces between them, it wouldn't work very well. So let me first demonstrate on this, and then I'll demonstrate on something that's low poly, so you'll see that I understand why. So I'm going to go into this case into vertex paint mode, and I'm going to I have set up here a different vertex paint, vertex color. And actually what I'm going to do, I won't do it in vertex paint, I'm going to do it in sculpt mode. In Blender, actually, you can paint in sculpting mode, and it works very well. So I'm going to paint it in sculpting mode, and I'm going to go to this thing. All right, so I just have it set up where I just did a new vertex paint, and I'll show you how it works. Basically, you just paint directly on the model. And because it's high poly and you're painting vertices, you can get quite detailed because there's so many vertices. The denser it is, the more vertices there are, and the more you can do detailed with your coloring. So I'll do it on high strength, and I set it here to symmetry, but I could do some quite detailed. There was actually much more high poly before then, and this has been decimated. But if it was a very high poly model, you would see you can do a lot of details, and if it was even more high poly, you can do even more details. So for example, I'm going to actually remesh this thing just to show you, and it's going to lose all of its coloring. What I'll do is I'll duplicate it, and I'll solo that, and then I will remesh it, or I'll remesh it at a higher rate, 0.005. We'll see what happens. It's pretty big, so it might not be a good resolution. All right. And now I can go even more detailed, and if I remesh it even higher, I can do even more detailed. So this could be a pretty detailed paint job, and obviously I can just paint very smoothly with this, And obviously I can do this adjusting the strength and using different textures and everything like that. There's another video I have about vertex painting, but just to show you, that's how this was done. So the actual color looks like this, and all of this was done in vertex paint, just directly on the model. Now, the advantage of this is that you can just paint it directly on the model, and you can do very detailed coloring if it's a high poly model. Once it's finished, what usually happens is once the vertex painting is finished, once you've painted your model, then usually you make a lower poly model and you bake this vertex texture onto the lower poly model, onto an actual texture map. But the vertex painting can be used for the initial hand painting, the initial painting, directly on the model. So that's vertex paint. Very useful, and in ZBrush, which is a sculpting program, that's what's used. It's called polypaint. Okay, so I'll get the other one off. No, that's the one I want. Okay, so now we have this turtle here. Right, so I'll go with that turtle. Again, the turtle, if I go onto just the model, you see that it's a very low poly model. There's no detail, and it's pretty low poly. And the model was originally a high poly model in ZBrush, or it could have been a high poly model in Blender, and it was hand painted. And the painting was done in a combination of hand painting and painting directly on a texture map. So this has a texture map. So let's go to the shading tab and you'll see the texture map. So this is the turtle, and this is the actual texture map. There's the texture map over there. So it has a texture map. The crab has no texture map. The crab cannot be used for a video game normally because there was no texture map there. That vertex color could be baked onto a texture map and then used in a program like Unity or Unreal Engine or whatever. This one has a map which is made. Now, if I want to actually paint the model directly, I could keep changing this if I want to. So for example, if I go onto this model and I could just paint directly on it, and you'll see it's transferred to the texture map. Or I could do the other way around. I could paint on the texture map and it will be transferred to the turtle. So normally this could be done directly on the model, again, kind of like the vertex paint, or it could be done, more likely it's done on a high poly model as vertex paint and then transferred to this texture map. So this was actually done as vertex paint in ZBrush and then transferred, baked onto a texture map. But now it's a texture map, and this can be used in a video game engine. So this is a texture map. So it's painting and it's texture. And this can be, I can adjust this by painting the actual texture map and adjusting. I can do whatever I want with this texture map. I could put it in Photoshop. I could adjust the colors. I could run, for example, some kind of filter on top of it. Like, for example, I could add a hue saturation value here. And then if I wanted to, I could do adjustments with the hue, for example, or the value or whatever I want. So there we go. We have an actual color map. Now you notice something about this. I'll take this off for a second. This model here has a normal map on it. That's why even without any color, you see all the details, even though it's a low poly model. That's the low poly model. That's the low poly model with the normal map. The normal map was taken from the high poly sculpture. So it has all these details kind of baked into it, into the normal map. So the color is not trying to fake these tiny details. The color is really just the color itself. Um, so this model has a normal map. So it's kind of a realistic kind of model. It's not sort of stylized. So I'll plug this back in. Now the next one here, the axe, as you'll see, is another model with a texture map. But this model over here has no normal map or anything like that. It's really a stylized axe. So the low poly model looks like this. It's just the shapes, and all of this stuff, the highlights and the little bumps and everything like that are just painted like a cartoon basically. So the texture map, if you want to see the texture map, it's really everything is in the texture map. So if you look at it here, the highlights, it's a painting basically. A painting that has been stuck onto a very low poly model. So I'll get back the axe. So this has been done either directly on the model or more likely actually painted directly in the texture map, like in Photoshop. So it's like you basically have the texture layout, the UV layout, and then you paint it on in Photoshop or in Blender directly, as if you're just doing an illustration. So this again needs UVs. So that the turtle and the axe both have a UV map. They obviously have UVs, and if I go into edit mode and I'll put on my overlay so you can see it. So now we have the texture map, and you see these are the UVs that have been that are laid on, and this is how you paint it. Basically, you unwrap it, and each piece is laid out properly, and then you paint the texture map basically directly over the UVs, like you're doing a flat Photoshop drawing, and then you keep checking it with the actual model. So this is a hand-painted model. Hand-painted not just because it's painted by hand, because it looks hand-painted. It's stylized. So far, we have vertex color with no UVs, just painted directly on the high poly model. We have this low poly model with a texture map, which has a normal map, so it's kind of a realistic model. Then we have this stylized model, which is a texture map, which is hand painted, which doesn't really look real, but it looks like a cartoon. And in this case, all the lighting information is actually painted on. In the case of the turtle, there are no highlights painted onto the texture map. That's done by the lighting as it hits it. But here, the lighting is baked on, so this highlight is painted on. So the lighting makes no difference whatsoever in this type of an axe, in this type of model. It's all fake lighting. Now the last one here is procedural. So the N1 here from the Mandalorian. So this is I did it really quickly here, but you can see that the model here looks like this. So the model is kind of sort of a detailed, sort of a semi-detailed model with all the paneling and stuff like that. And in this case, there's no normal map or anything like that. It's just the model. And then the coloring was all done just procedurally, which means there was no texture maps. It was all done with different nodes. So I'll show you the setup, which we'll get into in other videos. Let's go to the N1 here. Okay, so if you see the node setup, it looks kind of complicated, but it's all done procedurally. There's no hand painting. So there's layers that have so for example, I'll show you here. There are layers that have this edging here where you have the edges of it that are kind of chipped away and stuff like that. It's not very well done, I apologize. There are node setups that control this, the fact that it looks like it's worn out, and that's all controllable. So for example, if I go to this edging here, and this is here where this is where the edging is in this node here, and I can control, I'll do it in a more exaggerated way. I can control the edging, I can control the noise of how broken up it is. For example, by moving this node, this gives more of a subdued thing. This is more exaggerated. I can control the size of the edging, all that kind of stuff. And I'm doing it in kind of a subtle way. So what I'll do is I'll just connect this directly to the actual master node, and you'll see what I mean. This is one of the parts of the node setup, and once it loads, you'll see. This one is just in charge of the edging, the making the the edges look like they've been worn. So this is what it's using, and it's all procedural. I can adjust all of this. So if I want the edges to look more sort of worn out like this, if I want the edges to look, if I want the distance to be closer to the edge, more like right on like that, I can do that. And that's one of the nodes. And that would go into, let's see where I actually plug this thing into. Oh yeah. Okay. So hold on, let me just plug this back in. This is the final mix, I believe. Okay. And then there's other nodes that control this kind of um, breakup on the on the rest of it, the kind of dirty stuff. And there's another node that controls the ambient occlusion, which is the darkness in these areas. So I also have a node that's controlling basically how dark the dark areas are. See, that's making it more dark inside. That's making it less dark. So this is all procedural. This is all like adjustable. So there's no hand painting done at all. And of course, there would be, normally you would combine this with hand painting. Besides this, there's actually supposed to be little yellow stripes, which have to be added as well in hand painting. So you mix all of these different techniques together. So I could mix hand painting, procedural stuff, even vertex painting, and at the very, very, very end, all of these different techniques could be then baked down to a texture map. So, for example, this turtle started off as vertex paint, but now it's been baked to a texture map. This ship, if I were to do more of this procedural stuff, after I thought I liked it, I could bake it down to a texture map, and then it could be used in a game engine. So these are all these different techniques: vertex painting, uh, texture maps, and procedural. And usually they all end up being at the end texture maps because that's what you need to actually export them and use them in another program.